Next, it's our pleasure to welcome Marlene Towns. She's a teaching professor at Georgetown University's McDonough School of Business. She received a business degree from the University of Virginia, concentrating in marketing, and a PhD in marketing from Duke University. And as is not the case necessarily for most marketing academics, she has actually worked out in the real world for Big Five consulting with clients like AT&T and PepsiCo, and this is part of what gives her the experience and the expertise. And now I'm going to risk offending either Marlene or Ravi, but to be essentially Ravi Dar at Georgetown, running what is, I think, like YCCI at Georgetown, which is it's the Georgetown Institute for Consumer Research. So we're very happy to have you here with us today to demystify the dynamic duo of Facebook and Twitter. Thank you, Marlene.
Okay, thank you so much. And actually, to be compared to Ravi Dar is quite a compliment because I've followed his career quite closely through academia. And we actually have just started our institute at Georgetown. We're fledgling at a couple years old. So we look to this as a model of how to do it well. So thank you so much. I'm pleased to have my two co-authors here today. Tess Bradford is the VP at Bank of America of Digital Operational Risk. And Jay Legaspi is a second-year MBA student at Georgetown for about one more week. Exactly. So they are here with me, which is great. So I wanted to start with just a brief history of how we got into this research and how it kind of started. It wasn't as quite a traditional and obvious path as you might think. About 9 years ago, I came to this conference where I first presented some work that I was doing on young consumers. So a specific subset of Gen Y at the time, which were urban identifiers. So this is a general market segment of young consumers that are disproportionately influenced by inner city culture, hip hop, rap music, things like that. So everything from skaters to surfers to hip hop heads to fashion forward, trendy young people. And given that this was about 9 years ago that this work started, social media was not a factor. So we looked at where these consumers got information, how they were influenced with regard to products and brands, found that they were disproportionately influenced by entertainment, so music videos, television, film, celebrities. But social media was nowhere in the picture. Facebook was not around. So we were referencing magazines that people used to read back in the day. So going forward, and this work actually was just published recently, and so we kind of said, well, we need to update this. And Jay and I have been working on young urban consumer populations for some time, and Tess has come to speak in my class on digital and social and the impact that it's had, and so it all kind of fit, and the three of us kind of fit. So we wanted to look at, first, how does this segment work within a social environment? So what kind of usage differences exist? And a couple of the things that were going on in the background that made this particularly interesting as well and timely. This is right around the time that all the articles were saying, young people are fleeing from Facebook in droves because their parents are on it, and now it's old, and so they've moved on to Twitter, and Twitter is the new thing. Companies were jumping onto Twitter as the new thing. Facebook is now getting old, and so everyone is kind of moving. And so we were kind of not 100% convinced that this was actually the case, but wanted to look into that further. And the other thing that we noted was just from guest speakers that I had in my class and talking to people in industry, at the time, people were on the major platforms, but while technology was changing, and so that we have this new, as Alex was talking about, omni-channel presence, and so things are being formatted for mobile and for iPads and tablets and things like that. The content was not necessarily being formatted for each of these different platforms that existed. So if someone, if you put out content for Facebook or Instagram, you kind of just copy that, on Twitter, and you use the same content for these different platforms. But we thought that perhaps people were using these platforms differently and for different purposes, and so that might actually warrant different content for these different platforms. So we started looking first with this millennial segment on how people used these different sites. And one of the first things that jumped out at us in this data set was that we found that this millennial segment, we had a group of about 270 students, average age 19. They overwhelmingly used Twitter but for negative sharing. So if you wanted to share about a bad product or a bad service experience, this group was overwhelmingly going to Twitter, with Facebook second, and then a few other platforms. And also, what we found was interesting was that there were a lot of these students reported not sharing these experiences anywhere on social media. But then when you look at positive experiences, whether it's a positive product experience or a positive service experience, this same group was about equally likely to share this experience on Facebook and on Twitter, but then overwhelmingly in a service experience, and in a product experience, more likely to share on Facebook than on Twitter. And then also in those positive experiences, we saw an increased likelihood to share on some of the more visual sites like Instagram, Pinterest. These things popped up. So we thought that was a really interesting finding, that it wasn't necessarily by group, by age, or just an overwhelming shift to Twitter, but it was in these different circumstances or the type of information that people were sharing. And then some of the other questions that we asked to get a feel for the types of information that people were sharing and where they were sharing it within this segment. Family related, which didn't apply so much to this segment, as they're 19, 20 years old. They're not sharing information about preschools and pediatricians and things like that, but overwhelmingly would share on Facebook. Vacation, destination information, Facebook, also Instagram, obviously for pictures and the visual sense. Fashion, Facebook and Pinterest are the two sharing destinations. And then music, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube comes into the picture when it comes to music. Generally, though, it was a pretty interesting finding that these millennial consumers were less likely to share, period, than some of their older counterparts. So what we wanted to do, we thought that was interesting. We wanted to kind of take that to a couple of different levels. One, to look at a broader swath of age groups. So not just young consumers, but their parents, and also Gen Y, Gen X, that kind of in-between age group. Look at a larger data set, and then try to kind of go beyond the demographics and think about what are some of the individual characteristics that might drive this behavior, and then also some of the situational characteristics as well. That might affect this difference. So, and it was a bit reflective to me of the history of advertising. If you think about 30, 40 years ago in advertising, we pretty much cut the population in terms of demographics. This is our ad for old people versus young people, white people versus black people, men versus women. And that gave us a pretty simplistic approach to consumers. No need to preach to the choir here at a consumer insights group. But the insights into the consumer lifestyle and what people's motivations were and how they were living were really going to be more explanatory. So we wanted to look at some of those differences. So looking beyond these demographics, we wanted to find out, do people actually use these different platforms for different purposes? And then how might brands use this knowledge to maximize each platform? So if people are going to Twitter to complain, if this is kind of the complaint destination, does that make it any less effective for brand building? So and community building and the things that people look to Facebook and platforms like that for. Horizontal consumer communications, engagement with the brand, selling, which is often what our ultimate goal is in marketing. So how does this affect how we use each of these different platforms, and then what are some of the behavioral and individual differences that might necessarily contribute to this difference beyond demographics? So we looked to an existing model in consumer behavior. Folkman and Lazarus came up with a model of coping mechanisms. So particularly in this environment where you have negative experiences, are people trying to cope with these negative experiences in different ways, and does that lead them to one platform versus another? What we predicted going in was that this segment of the two segments that might come into play the most would be problem-focused coping. So one where you say, how do I solve this problem? And maybe we go on to Twitter. We predicted that people would use Twitter as more of a problem-solving venue. So you can tweet the company and you get a response, they take it offline, and then they solve your problem. And that the seeking social support might drive people more to a platform like Facebook or Instagram, but probably primarily Facebook, where you get that support from your friends, your family, other people that follow you. So that was our prediction going in, that those were going to be the two primary influencers of people's usage. So what we found, and this is over a pretty wide range of ages. We had about 300, just over 300 subjects, ranged in age from 18 to 72, with the primary segments being the 18 to 34 and 35 to 50. But we asked people, first of all, just in terms of product experience, where would you be most likely to share a good or bad product experience? We found that there was a shift. So most people in a good product experience would turn to Facebook. And so overwhelmingly in this population, Facebook was the primary destination. And then that number of Facebook shares got a little smaller and increased on Twitter when it was a bad product experience. So people were more likely to share a negative experience on Twitter. And then very similar pattern for service experience. So in a bad service experience, people were going to be more likely to use Twitter than Facebook. And also in the good side, you saw more of this shift towards the visual platforms like Instagram and Pinterest, et cetera. So that was kind of an interesting kind of parallel to that, to the finding of with the millennials, though not to the same degree, but Facebook was the overwhelming platform. We looked at the urban index to see if this kind of had any influence in how people used the different platforms. So just by way of brief definition, urban, it's racially diverse, majority white, but also well represented by African American, Hispanic, et cetera. And they're influenced by inner city culture, hip hop, style, and rap music. What we found here, and this is just the breakdown of the distribution. So obviously in the millennial segment, you had much more of an even distribution of urban, non-urban identifiers. In the broad range of ages, you had far fewer people who identified as urban, but there was still somewhat of a distribution. So we wanted to see if this lifestyle characteristic might influence the platforms that people were using and how they were using them. What we found here was that in negative venting experiences or circumstances, urban consumers were also more likely to use Facebook, and so this is across ages, than Twitter, and then also, or Facebook, we're less likely to use Twitter than non-urban populations, and similar finding for positive and negative. Also within service experience, similar finding where urban identifiers were more likely to use Facebook, less likely to use Twitter. So basically the two major, the urban identifiers acted like the majority of non-millennials. We also looked at how people shared. So were people active sharers as opposed to just kind of being the lookers and lurkers and receiving information, to see if there were any differences in terms of how active people were. So we looked at this urban index as a predictor of passive versus active sharing. And what we found was that urban identifiers were actually much more active sharers, particularly in Instagram. So this kind of more visual platform, there's a statistically significant difference there, where they're more active sharers than passive. And then a moderately significant level, YouTube, Twitter, and Vine as well, which kind of made sense because if you look at some of the defining characteristics of the urban segment, they are much more likely to identify themselves as leaders, style leaders, trend leaders. So to be kind of at the forefront of sharing as opposed to just receiving information made sense. And then in terms of sharing product experience, we cut that by age just to see if there was any difference there. And as we expected, the younger population was much more likely to use Twitter, and that likelihood decreased as the age increased. So the older segment was the least likely to use Twitter. Facebook, in terms of both positive and negative product experiences, much more likely to use, was much more likely to be used by the middle, I'm calling a middle age segment, but the 35 to 50-year-old segment. The millennials and the older segment, 50 plus, were about the same in their use of Facebook for sharing positive information. The young or the older consumers were a little bit less likely to use Facebook in terms of negative sharing. And then very similar findings in terms of service. So slight differences between product and service experiences, but for the most part the same. So we looked at this notion of passive versus active sharing as well by age, and found that there was, when looking at the age tiers, we found that the young segment was the most likely to share, or the most likely to be active sharers on Instagram than either of the two older segments, which was interesting too as well, because we found that we asked the question about, for young consumers, how likely are you to share information and your views and news and different questions in the real world, meaning not on social media. We had to define exactly what that meant. And they are far less likely to share their opinions in the real world than they are online. So some of the takeaways from this that we found kind of interesting. One is that age matters. So your older subjects are much more likely to share their experiences, their product and service experiences, period, in social media. So when you think about who's out there actually tweeting and posting on Facebook about this great product that I got, or this great vacation, or this great restaurant, these are going to be your older consumers that are more likely to share. Lower usage of the visual sites, Instagram, Pinterest, etc., and also Twitter, but a higher usage of Facebook for positive and for negative sharing. We also found to some extent that race matters. And I didn't go ahead and make charts for this because we had a very small racial breakdown, or not a significant racial breakdown. So the numbers of African American, Hispanic, Indian, or Asian, Indian, and Middle Eastern were quite small, but enough findings to kind of make it something interesting to look at. We found that African American consumers were more active sharers on Pinterest, which was somewhat interesting, and also more likely to voice opinions overall. We had a in that breakdown of sharing opinions, it was pretty much just a percentage. African Americans were at about 57% in terms of their likelihood of voicing their opinion, compared to Caucasians, which were about 42%. Middle Eastern, we only had 3 people, but they were at 82%. So apparently a very vocal 3 people of Middle Eastern descent. And then we found also that gender matters. So in terms of gender, women were far more active sharers of news. So just how likely are you to share news on social media? And then as is probably not a surprise, far more active sharers on Pinterest. Coping strategy matters as well. So seeking social support, if you think about those dimensions, and I'm going to flip forward to that. So seeking social support was a really significant driver of which platform people used, which was what we predicted. We kind of figured Facebook is a place where you have your friends, you have your family, you can get empathy and what have you. The other one that was also predictive of which platform people used was wishful thinking. So not so much the coping strategies. When we kind of talked through this afterwards and looked at problem-focused coping, which we thought would lead people to Twitter, but when we looked at the dimensions of problem-focused coping, it was things like thinking deeply about the situation, coming up with a strategy, coming up with a thoughtful strategy for addressing the problem, which is kind of the antithesis of how people use Twitter. Twitter is from the hip, gut reaction, tweeting my 140 characters, as a disgruntled consumer. It's not thought out. It's not necessarily, you don't take the time to think about it. By the time 2 hours has gone by, your tweet is old. Whatever you were tweeting about is long gone and people have moved on to something else. So it's kind of the antithesis of that problem-focused strategy. Wishful thinking, however, is this notion of an ideal situation. I wish this problem was gone. I wish everything was just better. And you're kind of thinking of this better place where you would prefer to be. So, and then urban identification matters as well. This is the more fashion-forward. These are leaders, influencers, more likely to share on platforms like Instagram. So then what we wanted to do was kind of combine this theoretical with the practical. So we have this data, we have this kind of theory about what's driving it. How do we actually make sense of that? And what do we recommend based on that for marketers? So, as opposed to a one-for-all strategy across all these different platforms, how do we tailor to make the most sense out of, or to maximize each of the platforms and what people are using them for and how people are using them? So looking at that wishful thinking category, so this is the ideal situation seekers, the aspiring fashionistas, this is kind of what we want to be. One was to, for marketers, enable bigger dreams by serving striking visual content, narrative, native content. So people things that help people kind of conjure up this ideal. So a great example of that is Four Seasons Hotel. And if you kind of compare Four Seasons and the Ritz-Carlton, the travel industry, I think, has a really good handle on the use of social media. The Four Seasons in particular, you don't see a lot of images of their actual properties and, come stay at the Four Seasons, in this particular city. They're images of the lifestyle. They kind of set this whole tone of luxury, these exotic locations and destinations, the architecture in different cities, the landscapes. So it really does kind of fill this picture of wishful thinking and what people want to see as their reality. And then also another strategy for marketers, entrust the segment to push the brand forward online. So within the context of that platform that they're using, give people leeway to kind of promote the brand for you, make them your ambassadors. And then an example, using Instagram to curate content that entices the segment to share the official content. So something that's so compelling, like some of the Instagram images that we saw, that people will want to share it kind of as their ideal, and then in curating their own personal brand image of who they are, who they want to be. And then within the social support framework, so the people that are going towards Facebook, these are the people that just want an ear, a sympathetic ear. These are our tech baby boomers, the 50 plus, and that 35 to 50-year-old segment as well. Trust that demographic to actively create these familiar ties. And then you create, as a marketer, create these ties with that segment so that you become one of those sympathetic ears and you can kind of join in the conversation. And trust that segment as well to push the brand forward, talk about it, and represent you well. And use Facebook, not necessarily Twitter, as an aggressive reminder of the other means of accessing the brand. So you can link to the brand page, what have you. So it brings to the social media world some common sense marketing strategies that we think of in the real world, but don't necessarily act on. So if you are trying to come up with a great strategy to promote your state and local government, and you want to say, we want to do a feel-good campaign that's really going to get people feeling good about our government, our municipalities, what have you, you might go to a park on a Saturday afternoon that's nice and sunny. You have families playing if the park is newly built, and you get all these warm and fuzzy testimonies about, oh, this was a vacant lot, and now it's a wonderful park that I can bring my family to. Great idea. Bad idea might be to take that warm, fuzzy, feel-good campaign to the Motor Vehicle Association on a Saturday afternoon when people have been sitting there for 2 hours waiting for their number to be called, and then you say, tell us how you feel about your state and local government. You're going to get some more colorful responses perhaps in that setting. So taking a feel-good campaign to a platform that people primarily identify as a complaint or a customer service or problem resolution platform kind of makes about the same amount of sense. So that's how you end up with some of the bigger disasters that we've seen, like the NYPD doing a feel-good campaign on Twitter saying, send us your pictures of your interaction with the NYPD, thinking that you're going to get people on the corner with their neighborhood cop, and instead you get these images of police brutality and you get all these different things. It went awry. It was probably ill-conceived from the beginning. But looking at what your platform is, how people use it, and you think of the personality of the site. I mean, Twitter, it's much more snarky, it's much more from the hip, it's much more sarcastic, and so people are in this kind of frame of reference. And as if to give me a perfect closing scenario anecdote, my dear friend and colleague from Pepperdine University, Andrea Scott, came in last night. Plan was to get here in time for the reception. It was going to be great. We're going to meet up and then go to dinner. And had just a planes, trains, and automobile day of travel. Sorry to put you on blast, but I'm going to tell the story. So a day of travel where, one flight she was told was canceled by the airline, and she was rerouted to get into New Haven instead of Hartford, and the flight wasn't canceled. That was a mistake. And then the new flight was canceled for mechanical issues, and so long story short, she got here at midnight. Her luggage apparently is in Hartford. So long day of travel, and we had texted, and I kind of saw where she was. But I followed her on Facebook, and with the post at probably about 11 o'clock p.m., stuck in the Philadelphia airport, and got the sympathetic ear. Dozens and dozens of replies. I was a bit of a lurker, sorry I didn't reply. But dozens of replies, oh, not the Philly airport, it's the worst. 2 words, fly Delta. I thought my day was crappy, but you win. So all these different, a sympathetic ear. Not, oh, here's the number that you should call and go and do this and fix the problem. And then her response towards the end of that was, thanks for the support and the shout outs. Looked like I'll be sending my second tweet ever to the airline. So it's basically kind of indicative of, this is what people use Twitter for. And I admit, back in 2009, I signed up on Twitter and used it primarily for my airlines, because when they would leave me stranded in an airport, I would tweet and they would get back to me. So again, thinking about not just who you're talking to, not just the specific, machinery or the technology of mobile versus tablets versus computer, which is terribly important, but also the platform. How are people using it? Does our message fit in this situation? Does it fit how people are using it and what people are looking to it for? And that's my presentation. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for 2 questions.
Oh, yes. Hey, Nick. My North Carolina friend.
Hey, so to what extent do you think this is about the platform? We heard about Facebook and the real identity. So is this about social identity management? Like, you don't want to be seen as a complainer. You don't want to be seen as a negative person on Facebook. But because you're maybe perhaps more anonymous on Twitter, it's okay to be negative.
I don't think so. I mean, I think people will complain on Facebook as well, but it's more in terms of what they're trying to get out of it. And partly, Twitter, it's much more brief. You can't go into the details. Facebook, you can be more narrative, more descriptive, but you're trying to get that feedback from your friends, from your family of, oh, I can't believe what you went through. I'm really sorry about that. And Twitter, I think that increasingly people are actually using I use my real name as my Twitter handle. So I think there is some more freedom or that people feel on Twitter to be more negative because they are probably more anonymous. It's not the full profile of your identification and who you are and who your friends are as on Facebook. But I think that what's driving it is probably more what people are trying to get out of that sharing experience. So, I mean, a lot of times you get more gory detail on Facebook of the problem. So there's more room to complain and to really gripe. But that's what really gets you the sympathy and the empathy and the response.
Yes. Do you have a sense of how long this negative impact on Twitter lasts? Or do you have some sense, or is it just, when somebody does complain, and this is right, I think you're right on that one, but any sense of, does it last for a long time for the brand, or what does it mean,
I think that it is harder hitting, it spreads faster, it spreads wider. People pick up on tweets, and these are the things that you see on the Today Show or what have you, the tweets that are out there. But I think that it dissipates faster. I think that, on Facebook, as long as people are still commenting, it will go back to the top of your feed, but it stays within that smaller set. I think that the Twitter world moves faster, so I think it's a bigger explosion, but it goes away faster.
Okay.
Unless it's something, really like the airline that accidentally tweeted a pornographic picture. That one stuck around for a couple of days.
Thank you, Marlene.
Thank you.